Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you for joining in on today's Discovery Farms webinar. This is the last webinar in our Discovery Farms Mondays in March Unmasking Misconceptions series. For those of you who joined along with the other webinars and today, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to get in some learning. If there's any webinars that you've missed and would like to revisit the recordings, I have been posting those on our website, which is www.uwdiscoveryfarms.org. You can see our social media information here pulled up on the slide. I encourage you to follow along with us on Facebook and Twitter. For those of you who are joining who may not be as familiar with Discovery Farms, we are an on-farm water quality research and outreach organization, and we are part of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. So our focus is on water quality and doing research on privately owned farms throughout the state of Wisconsin. Our program was founded in 2001. And we've stayed true to our original roots and have worked with farmers across the state. Today, we are lucky to have Matt Ruark. He is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Department of Soil Science, and he is also the Discovery Farms faculty advisor. And he's been doing some research with our program about nitrogen use efficiency, and he'll be presenting today talking about some data and information from that project. So I see Matt sharing his screen. A reminder, if you're a crop consultant, to please type in your name into the chat box and we'll get your credits recorded for CEUs. And also, if you have questions as we go along throughout this webinar, please share them in the chat box and we'll ask Matt those questions as we go along. So Matt, we'll let you have the microphone now.
All right, thanks, Erica. All right, so thanks everyone. And let me just make sure. So I think what we'd like to do too is if anyone has any questions throughout the webinar, just you're gonna write them in that chat box there to the side, and then Erica will chime in with asking the question. So it'll go be a lot more fun if people want to ask questions throughout. Otherwise, it's just me rambling on about nitrogen for an hour. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about is why we should keep nitrogen use efficiency in our toolbox, and really to provide some context of where does this fit in our nitrogen management plan. So obviously, let's start with the broad idea. What do we want and what do we not want? Where do we want and where do we not want the nitrogen to go? We want it to go into the plant or into the microorganisms. That's another aspect, right? It's staying in the soil system. And certainly we don't want it to go in the surface waters or the groundwater, right? So our big issue right now, or it's always a concern, I suppose, is that how do we minimize our the environmental impact of our agricultural practices? And so what are some of the big issues going on? And I like to use this report from the International Plant Nutrition Institute, this progress in reducing nitrogen loss in the Mississippi River Basin. We do have some progress, but when you start to measure the things in the Gulf of Mexico, we still see a lag. So what's the big issue is that, okay, now I'm having all sorts of problems here. Where we see all of the, we have all of these watersheds that flow into the Mississippi River. This is obviously, we have a lot of corn production in this area, a lot of nitrogen. When we look at the amount of fertilizer consumption in the US, and that's in the blue, and this has been tracked from 1987 to 2012. I don't know what I'm doing here. Is that the total US is in blue, and the total nitrogen consumption in the Mississippi River Basin alone is in red. And so you can see that, the majority of the nitrogen applied in the US happens within the Mississippi River Basin. So you can see that those trends have been a little bit, relatively flat over time, maybe peaking up a little bit from maybe, up, they go up and down over time. But so maybe a slow, steady increase over the past 30 years. When they calculated, so in this paper here, they use this modeling exercise to estimate, where is this nitrogen contribution coming from? This is the nitrogen. You can see over half of it is estimated it's coming from corn and soybean production fields in the Mississippi River Basin. So not, it's not 100%, 100% of the nitrogen isn't from our corn fields, but, up to, 50, about half of it is. And then what's the real issue is what is happening in the nitrogen, the loading of nitrate in the Mississippi River Basin. And the nitrate is in blue here. And you can see that, it bounces around year to year, and the total load, this is million metric tons of nitrogen. You can see, and they calculate this trend line in blue, you can see it's relatively flat. Maybe there's a little bit of a decrease over time, very, very slight. So clearly we haven't had this huge effect. If we're managing nitrogen better in the landscape, which is true, and I'll show a little bit of evidence of that, why isn't that reflecting here? So there's still a lot of pressure on agriculture to improve our nitrogen management. And interestingly, this is still a lot of nitrogen on an annual basis. If we're talking about over 2 million metric tons, that's going to relate to quite a bit of nitrogen. Calculate this could fertilize all the corn and nitrogen for 4 years. So it's not an insignificant amount of nitrogen. And then, of course, for those that are in Wisconsin, know the pressures in terms of reducing nitrate contribution to groundwater. This is a figure to demonstrate, the darker the red, the higher the nitrate concentration in groundwater. So a human health concern in Wisconsin. So the challenge for farmers, right, is that they're under extreme pressure to optimize nitrogen values. So farmers have selected the amount, the rates that they've decided upon rate, they've decided on timing, they've made their nitrogen management plan. And so they're going to base this on a whole series of things. Usually it's trial and error, right? Over time, they've gained more experience, right? This is obvious. So, every farmer has evaluated that over time. Some may be using UW guidelines to provide nitrogen. Some may be relying on adjusting it based on peer recommendations. There's a lot more farmer-led groups. Others obviously are using crop consultants or agronomists, or the perfect way, and the most true way to know it, right, would be to have an actual nitrogen rate on your field. Very cumbersome. So we're going to rely on either expert opinion across the whole level of groups here. So what we're going to promote here is the idea of nitrogen use efficiency as a self-evaluation tool that can shape these management decisions. So if a farmer was interested in knowing that they should change anything about what they're doing in terms of nitrogen, how would they know that? And then my assertion is that it's this assessment of nitrogen use efficiency that would be the first step and a helpful tool. So just to summarize where we're at with our UW guidelines, right? Sorry, this is in the way, but we have our recommendations for corn are based on 3 different things. Sorry, I put that in the way here, but you have to you start with picking your soil. And so you can pick a high yield potential soil or a medium yield potential soil. And then the one that's being hidden is the sandy soil. So that would be the first step. The second step would be to pick your crop rotation, your corn. It's corn following corn, or corn following legumes, or corn following soybean. And then you have to pick your nitrogen to corn price ratio, right? So right now, calculating urea is around 40 cents per pound. Corn's trading about 350. So that put the ratio of 0.11, so we can use 0.10 as an estimate. So what's interesting here is that also you think about like to move up in a range, if we want to that price ratio to be even more beneficial, we'd have to go to the corn prices would have to really increase for you to go down. Anyway, so this mostly just functions as a tool to demonstrate, that the lack of economic return under general, under certain price points, right? So if you're trying to achieve maximum yield, you might be out here, this would suggest that 190 pounds would be an optimal N rate if everything was very favorable. If corn was really valuable and nitrogen was really cheap, right? And then as nitrogen gets more expensive relative to corn, you go down the list. So, right. So actually it only makes sense to apply about 165 pounds of nitrogen, right? You don't get the economic value back for the nitrogen that you return. So it's a nice way to help conceptualize that. But of course there's some limitations in this. So what I was demonstrating here, and this is all available. Iowa State runs a nitrogen corn rate calculator, and you can just Google it, or here's the website. You can you put in your state and put in your recommendations. And so here I put in for Wisconsin under high yield potential soils in a corn following corn rotation, and I use the price ratio of 0.1 in this calculation. And it actually gives you the data. So there's 33 data points, or 33 N rate trials that have gone into this data set. And the calculation is then the maximum return to nitrogen is 162 pounds, right? However, there's this profitable nitrogen range that's also calculated as well. And it indicates that actually you're reaching about 98% of your maximum yield with this N rate. So you're not achieving 100% yield, you're achieving a little bit less. And so what this looks like, we conceptualize this. And so this is all work out of, all this is data collected by Dr. Lebowski at UW-Madison. So this is the nitrogen rate on the x-axis, and this is return to nitrogen on the y-axis. And you can see the fertilizer costs in the green, so the more nitrogen you apply, obviously the more costs. And then this is your gross return to nitrogen. So yields go up, and at some point they start to, the value you're getting starts to slowly decline until it reaches a maximum. So they've calculated here that the MRTN, the maximum rate's 162, and they calculate, well, there's kind of a flat response curve in the middle that provides that range of managing within $1 per acre. So it's a nice tool. Okay. But the problem is that there's still a lot of variation that underlies this calculation. And so this is demonstrated. Also, this is information also right from the N rate calculator of what percent of sites had the frequency of the economic N rate was in what range under certain percent of sites. So even 150 to 175 pounds of nitrogen, that was only about a third of the sites had that value, right? We're still working across a wide range of optimal N rates. And also, if we think about it, it's also graphed like this. So we have our optimal N rates here for every study that's included here, and the optimal N rates. And you can see there's no relationship between the optimal N rate and optimal yield, right? And so that's one of the reasons why in the Midwest, we've moved away from it being a yield-based goal and as opposed to an economic-based goal. Okay, so here's our, if we put our line in here in the green, that would be roughly 165 pounds of nitrogen, roughly our recommended N rate here. You can see that there's still a lot of variation in this data. Roughly 36, a third of the sites in this study had optimal N rates greater, and 2/3 had less. So little of this comes down to the statistical way that this is calculated, where it's an average of the response curves, not an average of these values specifically. So, but in any case, it demonstrates that there's still a lot of variation that we still need to figure out how to overcome, right? And so to know this, to know if we're, to evaluate that variation, I think that there's two simple measures that we can do. And so when we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, we are talking about a range of analyses. So I talk about nitrogen use efficiency as a general concept, and then I'm going to provide some specifics of specific measures of nitrogen use efficiency. So first is the partial factor productivity, and that's just simply the yield divided by the nitrogen applied. So this would be information that every farmer would be able to have. And then the other thing would be the partial nutrient balance, and that would be the ratio of the nitrogen removed in the harvested crop versus the nitrogen applied. So some people might be measuring this directly, or you could get some estimates of the nitrogen content in the grain, and you could figure out what that ratio is. So as we think about all these tools that we have in place, right? So we go from general to intensive. So at University of Wisconsin recommendations, we have there's some level of specificity, but it's still pretty general, right? These are nitrogen recommendations. It is split based on yield and crop rotation, but it's based on a data set with a lot of variability. The most intensive thing you could do would be to conduct a nitrogen rate trial on your field and then conduct that, year after year, and you would get the most truth of what is an optimal N rate in your field. That is, if you have the means to do that, that's great, but obviously that's very intensive and probably not feasible. So we're going to pitch this nitrogen use efficiency assessment as somewhere in the middle, where these assessments have an economic flavor to them, but also a water quality flavor to them as well. I think that, and we're going to promote this as a complement to the nitrogen recommendations. So the one big caveat on this whole thing too is that these cannot be used to determine an optimal N rate for a field, but it can be used to assess how efficient the nitrogen, is currently being managed. So it can complement nitrogen recommendations and nutrient management plans. It can be used to assess, any way you want it. You can do it across a farm. It can demonstrate field and soil dynamics within a specific farm and system. And it identifies if improvements can be made. And it can if we have some sort of benchmark. And that's what we'll talk about next is our benchmarking project. So not only is there, farmers can do this assessment, there's something that they can check it against. And then it could also be used down the road to evaluate if shifts in management are effective, right? So if changes in management are made, was it beneficial? So the big nitrogen use efficiency project began in 2015. So this was funded by an NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant. Thank you, NRCS. And we collected data from farmer fields. We collaborated with 85 farmers over the 3 years in 15 different counties, and we calculated, we got their yields, and we knew how much nitrogen they applied. And so we're interested in developing that benchmark and looking at trends in our data set. Across our data set, we've got 186 fields where we grew corn for grain and 110 for corn silage. So we'll go through a little bit on those two different crops. Now, certainly silage, we're removing a lot more nitrogen. We had, a lot of the cases were across roughly half the fields had manure, half didn't. We had, some fields that had conventional tillage, some with reduced, some with no-till, and then some with cover crops and without. So we can also look at some of these effects as well. In general, though, it's important to know that this data set represents silt loam soils. Excuse me. Obviously a popular soil in Wisconsin, or soil texture in Wisconsin, and on well-drained soils. So our data set really reflects these. If you're outside of silt loams that are well-drained, just know that this data set primarily reflects those two soil conditions. Okay. So we're going to say this is an easy assessment tool. You've already collected your yield, and you already know how much nitrogen you have, right? Shouldn't cost you anything to calculate it. Then we can consult the benchmarks to determine the NUE category for that field, and we can follow some decision trees for that category to determine if and what shifts in management would be appropriate. And then we can also evaluate nitrogen use efficiency in future seasons to assess if it's made. So let's start with that calculation. So again, just real quick, the partial factor productivity, it's the yield divided by the N applied. But this is important for those in our big dairy production systems in Wisconsin. We need to make sure we're calculating all the N that's applied. And so we can use a nitrogen management approach. And so we need to make sure we're crediting obviously all the fertilizer that we're applying, but also any of the book value for the fertilizer equivalent of the manure that's applied, as well as the legume nitrogen credit. So if you're following alfalfa, a pretty standard recommendation is to credit 90 pounds of nitrogen, if you're following that alfalfa, if you're plowing under an alfalfa stand. So having all the N inputs are really important. And so what does our data look like? So this is we use just simple univariate statistics We have corn grain benchmarks here, and we have corn silage benchmarks here. The partial factor productivity, and our average value was 73. So we're calculating everything in terms of pounds per pound. So converting that to bushels. So this would indicate 1.3 bushels per pound of nitrogen applied. So on average, the farms in Wisconsin are averaging 1.3 bushels per nitrogen applied. The 25th percentile, so it would indicate that the upper 25th, the upper 25% of farmers were getting 1.5 bushels per pound or greater. And on the low end, the bottom 25% were getting 1.1 bushel per pound or less. And so where does that rank? Is this good or bad? So one paper I like to consult, and I haven't seen too much of an update on papers like this, but this is some work that at least calculated this through 2000. And this is a mean annual corn yields in the U.S. So in the blue, this is grain yield. This is corn yields as it increased from 1965 to 2000. And in what we want to look at here is you can see fertilizer in red. Fertilizer is plateaued, at least it did for the last two decades before the turn of the century. And the PFP, so the partial factor productivity, has slowly and steadily increased. So in the year 2000, we were just shy of about 60, a value of 60. I just showed you a value of 0.73. So this is they're on the same units here. So sorry, not 0.73, sorry, 7.3. So the Wisconsin average is 73, and with our top 25% getting 83 or above. So certainly we're having in Wisconsin, at least among these farmers, we're seeing actually pretty good efficiencies. Interestingly, I did find some other recent values. One from Nebraska in 2012 that calculated a Nebraska average was getting 1.16 bushels per pound of nitrogen. And in Wisconsin, we just calculated and, we estimated 1.3 bushels per nitrogen. So, not too bad. So in any case, I think that these values show that we're skewing towards relatively efficient use of nitrogen. So the aspect though is that we still have, a certain amount where there's still some opportunities to improve. So as we expand our database, right now we're still working across the idea of a statewide average. So when we were doing this, we were hoping that we really want to collect a lot of data on, by region, by soil type, by farm management. And the one thing that we've learned is that we don't have big data yet, right? So we have enough good data to provide really strong estimates of statewide averages, but we don't have enough to really parse out this data set. So our future work is really trying to build this data set even more. So if you're interested, you could calculate your partial factor productivity and you can consult the benchmarks. And the way we decided to do it is we decided to put them into 4 different categories based on percentiles. So we have 4%. If you're in the upper 25th, if you're in the upper 25th percentile, we call that a high use efficiency. In the 25th to 50th, you're in the mid to high. If you're in the 25th to 50th, or the 50th to 75th, I suppose, then you're in the low to mid. And if you're in the bottom 25%, you're in the low. So what does this mean? So basically we're creating an average, right? We know what the average is. And the idea then, if you're above average, there still might be opportunities to improve. But if you're below average, there's a higher chance that there's an opportunity to improve your nitrogen efficiency and have some economic benefit to your nitrogen management. So that's what this premise is about. It's about identifying, is there an opportunity, and what your field is ranked at within this would give you the sense of, okay, yeah, there's an opportunity, or I'm actually not too bad in terms of efficiency. So there's 2 important factors to think about here. So when we calculate the efficiency, this partial factor productivity, we're looking at yield and we're looking at the nitrogen applied. So we can improve our partial factor productivity. Sure, we can reduce the nitrogen applied, but we can also do it by increasing the yield, right? And our goal here is if we're talking about reducing nitrogen applied, we want to talk about it in the context of reducing it and applied without an economic loss. This isn't about maximizing it at risk of economic gains, right? This is about how can we manage, if we're on the low end, how do we manage it while still being economically efficient? So much like other data set related to nitrogen and corn, we have not seen, certainly we have not seen a relationship between the amount of nitrogen supplied to a field and the yield calculated. So this is grain yield at 15.5% moisture versus N applied. See, it's a no universal relationship in Wisconsin. The more nitrogen doesn't mean more yield. And you can see at any one rate, there's a range of yields that can be achieved. So here we go. So Abby has color coded this for us in terms by category. So this demonstrates two things. As we increase the nitrogen supply, we tend to move down the chain in terms of use efficiency category. But also as we increase yield, we're also, based on the nitrogen rate, as we're increasing the yield, we can be applying 150 pounds to be in the low efficiency category or be in the high efficiency category, right? So reducing N is perhaps only one part of it, and evaluating your entire management plan for your yield is also another huge part of this as well. Our lowest use efficiencies are seen at when we're getting the lowest yield or when we're applying above 250 pounds of nitrogen. So there's certainly things that we need to work to lop off, right? So if we're applying 250 pounds of nitrogen or more, that's probably too much. And if we're getting less than 100 pounds, 100 bushels of yield, how can we work to improve that? Because that's not efficient either. But it is, and we do want to stress this, right? Rate isn't everything, and we want to promote the idea of all these other things that you're going to think about in terms of management, right? All the agronomic factors, seeding density, variety hybrid selection, weed management, insect management, all of those things that can contribute to higher yields are only going to move you up in terms of efficiency category. So I drew a couple lines here just to demonstrate the range in values here, right? So if our recommendation is our current recommendation is 165 pounds of nitrogen, you can see this wide range of, this is in the green line here, in the yields that we're getting. So you can, at our current recommendation, right, you can be getting low efficiency or high efficiency at that rate. So the rate is just the starting point, and then everything else that goes into it is going to drive how efficient that we can be with that nitrogen. I just want to bring this back into the partial nitrogen balance aspect. So if these categories also relate to a nitrogen balance. So the idea in a perfect world, we'd be removing roughly the amount of nitrogen we apply. So the closer you can get your partial nutrient balance to 1, the better. So in these cases, excuse me, in these cases, we're seeing that if you're in the high efficiency category, you're getting a partial nutrient balance of about 88. So you can think about that as 88% of the nitrogen you're applying is removed in the grain. This doesn't reflect the amount of nitrogen lost from the system or contributed to groundwater. It just is a quick assessment of the balance. So closer to 1 would imply greater efficiency. In the mid to high efficiency, we're getting 78 to 88. So really, this is a pretty good rate. If we're getting about 80%, that's not too bad. Getting to 90% would be really good. So half the fields that we're working with here have a partial nutrient balance of 80, almost 80%. So that's generally a positive story. And in general, then the greater, if you're have a smaller efficiency would imply, or a greater partial nutrient balance would imply you might be losing less nitrogen. So going from your low to mid to the mid to high efficiency range means that you have a greater conservation of nitrogen. We also really want to stress this point that increasing yield is important to increasing nitrogen use efficiency. So here we've graphed it like this, the yield group. So the greater nitrogen that we apply, the greater yields that we're able to obtain, the greater the partial factor productivity. And things actually tend to plateau out here, around above, 200, 210 pounds, 220 bushels of yield. where we're getting these consistently high partial factor productivities once we're achieving these higher yields. So achieving high yields is a key aspect of use efficiency. So then we convinced you, right, that hopefully that, like, okay, we have, it's a worthwhile measurement and we have a worthwhile data set to compare it to. So then what would be the decision? You're in that category. Okay, what's the next step? And so we developed these decision trees, and we actually have a nice publication that's on our Discovery Farms website, where we have these decision trees for every single category. But I'm just going to delve into the low efficiency category because it's the one that I think most people will use. If you're in the low efficiency category, it would indicate that the vast majority of farmers in Wisconsin are actually getting more value out of the nitrogen than you are. So that would indicate, okay, there might be an opportunity to improve. And so we're going to provide this this decision tree to kind of help people think through the process. So step one, did you achieve the yield goal for this field, right? And if the answer is no, then nitrogen isn't probably the sole driving force for low nitrogen use efficiency. We do need to acknowledge, obviously, that there's year-to-year variation. And so is this an anomaly year that we're comparing or that we're evaluating? That's important to know. Or is it, or is it something else? It's something, is it a weather issue? Was it a disease issue, insect issue? What happened? And then is that something that you are prepared to address or not? And that's the case, right? Then if you can identify the cause, even better, right? And then try to do whatever needs to be done, right, to reduce that pressure and then reassess. If you didn't achieve your yield goals and nothing really happened, then that's the case where maybe this isn't a realistic yield goal. All right, so that would probably be an anomaly. Hopefully every farmer has realistic yield goals, but it's good to reassess. And this would be a good indication that it's not. But if you did achieve your yield goal, like, so you got the yields you were expecting to get or better, what's going on now? So the first question is, if it's yes, then the next question we want to ask is manure and or legumes, are they included in your rotation? Did you properly credit them? And so we found that this was a huge driver of nitrogen use efficiency in Wisconsin. And so we have here, if we, in this category, this is, so each of these pie charts here, this is for fertilizer only, and this is for fields that had fertilizer and manure or legume credits. And you can see that for fields that had fertilizer only, most of the fields, 60 to almost 75% of the fields were in that mid to high use efficiency category. When you go to fields that have manure or legumes included, and this again is based on a book value crediting, right? 90 pounds for following an alfalfa stand and the book values for the available N for manure. We see less than 50% in that mid to high use efficiency. So a lot of our issues, or a lot of the reasons why this is because of improper crediting, right? So we did the crediting, we included that in our calculation, and so we're seeing maybe some over application or maybe some opportunities for farmers to realize more value from their nitrogen and manure in their legumes. So if that's the case, then did you take the credits? If you didn't, think about taking the credits, right? And if not, crepes, okay. And if not, if you took the credit, if you're including manure and you took the credits, then that's the case. Once you get down this list, then our recommendation is to consider reducing nitrogen, right? So we went through all the other factors that could be limiting it, and then the last option is talking about reducing nitrogen. So if nothing else is limiting, you're getting really low efficiency, then consider reducing your nitrogen rate. And again, then that goes into all the things. And the problem is we can't tell you right now, or I couldn't tell you right now exactly what to do. That's going to be farm and field specific, right? So, but there's lots of things to play with, but that would be the opportunity of say, okay, yes, for sure, there's an opportunity, and now might be a good time to test it. And then the last aspect is that you can evaluate it across future seasons. And so a lot of this is one of the big issues that we always have, and we always had the question of like, well, we do see year-to-year variation, right? And that's true, and everyone sees that. But across our data set, we're not seeing tremendous year-to-year variation when we're looking at statewide benchmarking, right? So for partial factor productivity for grain crops, we're seeing it range from 68 to 80. We have this average by year. And also the important thing is where the average is, but also what the variation year to year is. We're seeing similar variations year to year. Now, as you're doing that in your own field, like you're going to see more variation than in our large data set, but that's why it's important to keep assessing year after year and reassessing, is this, what was the limiting factor? And if it was weather, and that's not something you can control, then that's something to acknowledge. So we do feel confident that we can average this, our data set over years, and then it's up to the end user to understand the yield limiting issues year to year. So the key lessons from our data set. See again. So all the fields applying over 250 pounds of nitrogen had low use efficiency, right? And then even with fields within a 50-pound range of a recommended rate, nitrogen rate was not the sole driver, right? There's just as much variation in one direction as there was in another, meaning that the yield is such an important driver of this at a specific end rate, and that's why calculating it would be really good to know. Farmers using multiple nitrogen sources, especially organic nitrogen sources, manure and legumes, right? It can be a challenge to achieve high efficiency without properly crediting it. So this was kind of a wake-up call for us. Maybe we haven't done as good of a job promoting these manure and legume credits as we should. So some opportunities to get some more education out there, and some opportunities to really take advantage of some of the nitrogen that we do have out there. With the rest of our data set, we didn't find trends in terms of number of applications, use of inhibitors or slow release fertilizer products, or other management practices. Our data set isn't big enough, and I put yet here, to evaluate how to fine tune the nitrogen. So we feel like, we did a lot of intensive work to get, nearly 300 fields assessed for nitrogen use efficiency. And the aspect is that this still really isn't big data. So our future work, we'd like to figure out ways where we can work with farmer-led watershed groups to help build this data set and build our understanding. So the more data that goes into this benchmarking data set, the more opportunity we have to help fine-tune. Okay, were there differences in efficiencies in tilled fields versus no tilled? Were there efficiency differences in different parts of the state? So right now we don't have enough data to really fine tune it to that level. And again, we don't have any differences by soil type or management type either. So we'll see as this data set continues to evolve and continues to grow, then we're hoping to have that eventually parsed out. So I'd like to then end with this. So in terms of a take-home message, that assessing nitrogen use efficiency has value to improve the economic efficiency and to reduce nitrogen loss. So it comes at that first step basis. You've already decided, everyone already has a nitrogen management plan. Well, I mean, everyone already has the way they apply and manage nitrogen, let's say, right? How would you know how to change? What would be the one piece of information you could use? And it would be this. So you can use our publication, our Discover Farms publication, to identify if there are realistic opportunities to improve your nitrogen management. And then this idea, is there even a reason to consider it? If you're already sitting at if you're up in the 90th percentile, yeah, you're doing pretty good. There's probably not too much more to do. Nice job. If you're sitting down in the 15th percentile, yeah, there's probably some opportunities, right? So, and that would be good to know. Things maybe you haven't even thought about yet. And you can also use this to compare across your fields and growing seasons, and you can get a really good assessment of which fields are more efficient than others and how you might want to manage, where you'd want to start some nitrogen management work. You can also use it to track it over time. Are you getting more efficient on your farm over time or not? And then lastly, if you're in the lower end of the range, there might be opportunities to improve. Yes, I'm talking about nitrogen management. I'm a soil fertility guy, but there's also all the other things you can learn from other aspects of crop management. All the agronomic tweaks of the system, insect, disease, pest, weed management, those sort of things. So I can't stress that value enough, the value of those things enough, right? So everything you can do to to improve your yield at the same nitrogen rate is going to have benefits to water quality. So then as we move this forward, right, I'm kind of leaving it a bit short here, right? I'm kind of saying this is the step, and then what do you do? But then there's all these other things that are happening as well. I think that there's also some value in utilizing a zero nitrogen strip on your field. So if you have an area, what kind of yields do you get without any nitrogen? So first off, I think that this could be a nice assessment of soil health, right? How does your corn do when you're done and put out nitrogen? Could be a simple metric. It could also it could be to understand the real value of the fertilizer, right? So in some of these measurements, we're giving the full yield. We're giving that credit to the fertilizer, but in reality, it's only the fertilizer gain. And then lastly, it gives us an opportunity to calculate a nitrogen budget. What's an estimate of the actual amount of nitrogen lost from your system? So our data set here is another thing we're trying to build. We don't have enough data to provide any benchmarks for a zero nitrogen strip for this kind of stuff either. But again, that I think it would be a wonderful thing if we could do, and we're working to build. The other aspect then is, what about all these other technology, right? We're talking about just playing around with tweaking rate or do some split applications. But what about all these sensing and modeling approaches to fine-tune nitrogen? And that is, where are we at with that? And there's a lot of others that are trying to assess this. Right now, I think the collective understanding, it's still pretty variable. The sensing and modeling approaches haven't been fine-tuned enough to be any more, maybe only, are they any more or less valuable than our general approaches with using UW recommendations, maybe with some soil testing. But on the other hand, they're the only way, these approaches, the only way to account for the spatial and year-to-year variation, right? So these sort of things, getting them to work would be crucial. Are we there yet? Probably not. Should we continue the research and development of these things? Absolutely. And it'd be fantastic to get them to work, because those will help us overcome that variation. Right now, we are just sort of living with that variation and working across averages. It's where we're at, and there's obviously tremendous variation in our data set too, but moving forward, that's the approach. So I'll end with this. This is our publication, our nitrogen use efficiency publication on our Discovery Farms website. It's got all the equations, it's got the summary of the data set, it's got the benchmarks in it, and it's got all the decision tools and their decision trees to go through. So it's a really fantastic data set, a publication. And one more thing is that we're partnering with producer-led watershed groups to monitor nitrogen use efficiency. And so now, granted, this year things are going to be a bit limited with our ability with travel and those sort of things. But as this is a lot of stuff that farmers can collect data with, and we're partnering with a lot of groups. If you're interested, feel free to contact us, or certainly contact your local watershed group to get involved. And with that, I'm happy to end it here. If there's any questions, here is our Abby Augarden, who's a big part of this, put a lot of this data together. She's our nitrogen use efficiency project coordinator, and deserves a lot of credit for this presentation as well. So with that, I'm happy to, I don't know if anyone has any thoughts, has any additional comments, questions?
If anyone has any questions for Matt, feel free to put them in the chat box now. And a reminder, if you haven't typed your name in the chat and you're looking to earn CEUs, to do so.
I see there. Sorry. So there's a question: are we taking any credits for soil organic matter? And so, so the answer is no. Well, we're not. And right now, we're working mostly across silt loams, right? So we're working across a range of soil organic matter. That's kind of a controversial one. So for our other recommendations for other crops in the state, we do have recommendations split out into these broad soil organic matter categories, right? So 0 to 2% organic matter has much higher nitrogen recommendations for other crops. And then we have these broad categories, 2 to 10% as another category. So fundamentally, soils with greater organic matter will generally tend to, to have more nitrogen supplied, but we don't have enough information we don't have a sophisticated way to build that into our recommendation system of yet. And that's a huge part of these modeling and sensing systems, right? So it may be the organic matter gets built into it. It may be some other soil health, some other biological measurements that get built in. And so I think there's a lot of effort and work in moving that forward. I think that right now, there's some indication that there might be some other tests that get at the biological activity that could be useful in fine-tuning soil organic matter. Unfortunately, that's a whole another hour presentation, but a great topic for another day. Any idea what percentage of farms are using 0N strips? Not many. It's what we're trying to promote among our growers and our farmers. I would say that it's a process, right? The first time we were doing it, we had a lot of really messy data, and the more years we've been working with the farmers is to get better data. So right now we're probably sitting at about 30, 40, 50 site years of data with 0N strips. And that's much more intensive of what we promote in terms of measurement. So we actually want to know the total amount of nitrogen taken up by that plant also. So we're getting a lot of measurements being done on those 0N strips. So they're much more labor intensive. But once I think we're still working through that data and to get some benchmarks put together. I think there is tremendous value. It's a harder thing to sell. You don't necessarily need a big area for a 0N. It's an area. If you can just skip enough of an area that you could pick up with a yield monitor or be willing to go out and hand harvest a small strip, you're going to get a lot of information about your soil from that 0N strip.
I'm posting a link in the chat. We created a publication last year that was a guide to conducting your own NUE study. So we'll kind of dive deeper into implementing a 0N strip and those sorts of metrics. Another important person to recognize that's been part of this project is Kevin Klingberg. He mentioned his name in the chat earlier. He's worked with our partners in Pepin and Dunn County to contribute data to this project also.
That's great. There's another question. Are there nitrogen tests being calibrated? Being used to calculate all the nitrogen that's available in the soil? And so the short answer is yes. And then I always have a long answer, right? So there's been several studies over the past years that have just, I think within this past year, that have tried to figure out which one or collection of measurements are the best to use. And there's some indication that every single one that we tested have some value. So there's some that are just measures of labile carbon pools in the soil. So basically, how much carbon in the soil or organic matter is going to be available to microorganisms. Like that might be a good test. Some may be these soil incubations where you let the microbes tell you what's happening. How much nitrogen is mineralized or carbon is mineralized by the microbes over a short period of time, plus additional other types of tests. So right now there's a tremendous amount of work, and unfortunately I don't know exactly what should get promoted or not yet. But I think there's a lot of evidence that there's several things that could work, and we're continue testing them. Kevin just brought up the fact that many of our projects use fields of 0 strips were only 120 feet long, 90 feet wide. I mean, again, that's a good chunk of land, but for the value you're getting, and a lot of times I think it's not tremendous yield loss in that area. Let's see. So Mark made a comment about anticipate working with farmers, and then will future research specifically look at NUE as a tool to reduce nitrogen leaching losses to groundwater? So that's a great question. And so I've kind of avoided, the idea of connecting it directly is hard. If we use a zero nitrogen strip, that would have to be used to know the true nitrogen balance, right? Because we can know what's being supplied from the soil, we know what we applied, we know how much nitrogen is taken up. We could be able to calculate the unused nitrogen from the fertilizer. To assume that 100% was leached to groundwater may be difficult. So we do have some other potential losses, but it would at least give some sort of index of where we're at. So we're going to get all the way to reducing, to calculating what's leached to groundwater? No. Would we be able to calculate kind of a nitrogen balance and a nitrogen budget? Then yes. Those leaching losses of groundwater are tricky. They're difficult to do direct measures on. And I think in the future, there's several studies that are occurring where we're trying to do that. Ultimately, I think that's going to have to be some sort of index or modeling approach. But I think ultimately it's giving enough data to figure out which management practices can move us in the direction we want to go. And see. Oh, there's these used showing cover crops and other practices can optimize nitrogen. Well, so I conduct a lot of different nitrogen and cover crop trials, and so we just wrapped up a lot of research on our experiment stations relating, using cover crops with manure applications, and which generally showed positive aspect for water quality, that the cover crops take up manure, the nitrogen from the manure, but it also steals a little bit of nitrogen away from the corn the next year. So we got to figure out how to optimize those systems. This year, starting this fall, we're going to be conducting a lot more work on farm, working with farmers to see how well these things are operating on actual farmer fields. So a lot of that work will continue, I guess, with my program in collaboration in contact with Discovery Farms. Let's see. Jim Studi says, have you calculated the PMP to incremental and following cover crops? And so that's along the same lines. And so the thing is with cover crops, and most of the research that we're doing with cover crops is related to following corn silage. And especially in situations where you have all that exposed soil where the cover crop's going to grow well. And there might be, there might also be fields where you're going to have fall nitrogen applied. So I've got tons of data on that, and I'm sure you'll see me present on a lot of that data from time to time over this next year. Otherwise, if anyone's interested, feel free to send me an email. I can send you a link to my latest PowerPoints on cover crops in those systems. And then, does it show any differences in NUE between no-till and conventionally tilled fields? And and that's an aspect. So right now, no. Does that mean that there isn't? No. We just don't have a big enough data set. So what we're doing here is we're trying to circumvent having to do nitrogen rate trials across all of these fields. And I point to North Dakota, where they've altered their nitrogen recommendations. If your field has been in long-term no-till, they're actually recommending slightly lower nitrogen rates. So fields that have been in long-term no-till seem to be supplying more nitrogen. We talk about big data, and we've been doing our best to try to collect big data, and we got 300 data points, and it's nowhere near big enough. So our next efforts are to figure out how to ramp this up big. But we gotta, basically it's going to be a community approach. It's going to be a crowdsource approach where everyone contributes, and we can build these data sets to see if we can identify if we're seeing those sort of things in Wisconsin. So unfortunately, yeah, it's for the approach we're using, it's a data hungry approach. We gotta get thousands of data points, not hundreds, but we'll get there. So the question is, what research work is being done to look at nitrogen as being delivered to surface water directly through the field drain tile? Right. Okay. Okay. So, that's, when we usually, okay, where do I start with that? So I took out, I might go back to my my presentation here if you'll humor me. If I included no, I didn't include I didn't include the drain tile stuff. So in other parts of the Midwest, that's the you know, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, there's obviously a tremendous amount of tile drainage. And it's a primary way nitrogen's being delivered to surface water. So when we look at the delivery to the Gulf of Mexico, it's pretty heavily through tile drain. In Wisconsin, our tile drained areas tend to be in the Lake Michigan watershed. So the nitrogen losses, while high through can be quite high through the tile drains, are going to Lake Michigan, where we tend to be more concerned with the phosphorus. The nitrogen from the tile drains that's getting into the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, that's what's contributing to that hypoxic zones. So other states are primarily focused on trying to reduce nitrogen losses from tile drains. There might be more engineering solutions, right? So if you're collecting the water and it's being, for lack of a better, it's a somewhat of a point source, right? It's coming right out of that tile drain. That can be addressed. In Wisconsin, where we've done work with tile drains in the eastern part of the state, these are heavier clay soils, more prone to that high shrink swell, more macro pore flow. So we've seen actually a fair amount of phosphorus loss through the tile drains. So in ways that that we might be underestimating phosphorus losses from these fields if we're just thinking about surface water. That said, in general, tile drainage from a water quality perspective tends to mean more infiltration and less runoff, right? So we're gonna, generally speaking, less runoff and less phosphorus losses compared to non-tile drain fields. That said, then the trick is then by installing a tile drain, you tend to be moving more nitrogen out towards surface waters. So in some parts of the state, we may see better water quality, better groundwater quality, if it's an area heavily tile drained, as the nitrogen basically is bypassed, right, and goes right to surface water. So it's sort of a trade-off with that. There's no right way. If you have tile drains, then you have also more engineering solutions to try to manage nitrogen and contributions to surface water. I guess is what I'll leave it at. But we also have, and I'll turn that over, if you are interested in any of our tile drainage work, I encourage you to visit our Discovery Farms webpage. We have a lot of, I think that's probably where most of the tile drainage water quality work in Wisconsin is being conducted through. And so we've got several fact sheets and reports on our tile drain research. And Eric Cooley is kind of our point person on that.
Thanks, Matt. If there's any last questions for Matt, feel free to type them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. And thank you, Matt, for presenting today. And thanks, everyone, for joining in on this webinar series. Once the recording's done downloading, I'll be posting it on our website. So feel free to check that out.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great questions. Good luck this year.